Hi, Angela Fehr here. My peonies behind me are almost done blooming, and that means I won't get to enjoy their beauty for another year. But that's okay, because I get to paint them, and one reason I love painting in watercolor is because I can take the things I love and just enjoy and celebrate them in my studio, on paper, in my favorite colors, and really just savor those things that I love all year round. So I'm going to paint a peony today. I'm going to be demonstrating some loose and fluid watercolor techniques. We're going to be using wet and wet techniques on a smaller scale to create beautiful fluid moments in our paintings. This lesson is a part of my World Watercolor Month Watercolor Summer Challenge. So if you're painting along with me, make sure to hashtag your projects, Watercolor Summer Challenge and World Watercolor Month, and then visit watercolorsummerchallenge.com to enter to win some of the supplies I'm using in my lesson today. And there's a host of other prizes and a great big grand prize as well. My sponsor this week is Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. I'm using their American Journey watercolor paint and Kilimanjaro cold press 140-pound watercolor paper. For more information on these products and to enter to win a prize package from Cheap Joe's Art Stuff, you can head over to watercolorsummerchallenge.com and enter this week's giveaway. Our prompt today is wet and dry, and I think when it comes to watercolor, really anything that fits everything we paint, because we're always working with wet and dry watercolor techniques to create our paintings. And using water and knowing how much water to use is, I believe, the biggest learning curve in watercolor painting. Knowing which techniques to use, wet on dry, dry brush, etc., is first of all, a decision you have to make for each part of your painting. But then you also need to get to know how much water to use when you're creating imbalances of water that make blooms, and just what's going to happen with the different varying amounts of water. Artist David Becker uses the term float your pigment when he's talking about painting with watercolor, and I love that term of floating, because it really is a lot of what I do in watercolor is allowing the paint to float on the paper. So I'm placing some nice juicy brush strokes right now, kind of thinking about the peonies that are about to bloom in my yard. As I place those strokes, I don't rub until they soak into the paper, and good watercolor paper, like this Kilimanjaro, will allow a little time for the pigment to move and settle in on the paper. And that gives us time to dot in color. I'm just adding a little bit of permanent rose to flow into my quinacridone gold. And when I'm working with this amount of water and pigment, I get this beautiful floating effect. So I can create, my petal right here. I can touch in a little bit of color. I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue just to add a shadow. Probably, and that's too much ultramarine blue, but because my pigment is floating on the paper, I've got some time to come in and maybe move that color into the swell of water there. Or I can choose to use a thirsty brush and use that thirsty brush as a sponge to lift out excess moisture. And I do both. When I'm painting in watercolor, when you're working with wet and dry techniques, you want to be very watchful and engaged at all stages of the painting, because as it starts to dry, the pigment is doing stuff, and we continue to see beautiful things happen. And we also want to prevent ugly things from happening, and we have options. So right now we're working wet on dry. This is allowing that juicy pigment to stay within the boundaries that my brush has defined. And this is actually my very favorite technique. It gives me the fluidity of watercolor, lots of options for letting things flow, but it also gives me control, because I don't put that brush stroke down, and if my paper was wet, it would instantly spread across the entire page. Often though, I like to create a wet on wet look by starting to let some of that color flow. Perhaps I want my peony petals to flow out from certain portions of the flower, and to start to create some maybe additional petals or some color in the background. So once I've placed that first defining stroke and given it a chance to soak in, look how it's created a little line there of pigment, then I can choose to moisten that edge and let some color start to move out. And that can be defined as additional petals, or I could wet that right out to the edge of the paper and create a background. And as I talked about last week, we get to work quickly but intentionally. We're painting, we have a limited amount of time as things start to dry, but we start to see the possibilities, the different things that happen at the different stages of the drying period. So right now, while things are shiny and moist, I've got actually puddles of color here, whereas toward the center of the flower, the drying, it's a little further along. And so I have my beautiful peony starting to happen here with rich pockets of color where things have flowed, puddles where things are continuing to move, and I can dot color in and let it flow. I want to reiterate again the difference between a juicy brush, a neutral brush, and a thirsty brush. I mentioned already the thirsty brush where we blot the brush and we use it to lift color, and this works really well. When we want to have some control over how things lift, we can blot our brush, form that point again, and then using the brush to very specifically lift color and moisture from certain areas. Not only does this lift that color if it's gotten too dark, but it gives us, it takes away water, so then we have less movement. Water in watercolor equals movement, so when you want your pigment to move, we can use a juicy brush with either pigment on it already or just a clean brush, which is what I'm doing right now, to flow more color out from our object. And I'm always aware that color flows much further than I think it's going to. I draw the brush away from my flower, and the drawing away creates movement out from the flower. And you can actually see there's a faint pink puddle there. So if I were to just stop my brush mark right here and leave that little puddle against the white paper, you would see a line once this is dry. You always need to moisten further than you think, or lift pigment, and I probably should get a clean paper towel for this range of colors. So a thirsty brush provides control. It lifts moisture, it lifts pigment, and it slows the movement of your painting. Now a juicy brush, when your brush is loaded with water, you can cover a lot of ground and create channels for the paint to follow. Just as we've done here, we moistened and pulled the color out. And when we move our brush, when it's loaded with water, it also creates direction. So we're creating a space, a moist area for more movement to happen, and we're also indicating which way the movement should go. The water tension is pulled away from our flower, or if we push in towards the flower, we would create movement into the petals rather than away from them. With that juicy brush, we can also load it with pigment and place more color. And depending on how much moisture is on the paper, we're going to see different effects happen. Where the color is starting to dry, well, first of all, where things are very moist, we're going to see a lot of movement. And over here, especially, there's a little puddle of additional moisture. So I can know that my color is going to flow, and I can direct that flow. And I'm actually going to pull and start to create the other half of this flower here. So then I'm going to just soften this. I don't want to be too committed to a shape at this point. I want to maintain softness in my flower. So I'm actually going to moisten this whole area, but not this area, because I want to have a little bit of white space, just like I have here on this side of the flower. So we're going to give it a minute. More juicy brush now. I'm going to touch in that brilliant permanent rose right here. And you can see again what I'm saying about the color floating on the surface over here. And on the dry paper it's floating as well, but it's also staying within those boundaries that I've defined. Your paint has to be very wet indeed for the pigment and water to break free from those wet areas. So if you want your juicy color to flow onto dry paper, you have to tell it to do that with your brush most of the time. And if you're working with so much water that it just spills over onto the rest of the paper, you're probably working with too much water. So when it's wet, I can also tilt and let some color flow. And again, it's going to flow where you direct it. Gravity is going to take a role here. And this is as long as the pigment is floating on the surface of the painting. Once things start to absorb, you'll start to see the painting lose its shininess. That's when you know you're probably not going to see nearly as much movement anymore. Now I'm going to talk about those lines that we get when the pigment flows to the edge of your shape. Sometimes when you're painting, you're going to see after it's dry, I'm going to actually paint a leaf over here. So we're painting this shape, and after it's dry, you might see a fairly strongly defined outline and edge on your around the edge of that shape. And what that comes from, and I think we're actually going to see it more over here possibly and a little bit in there. We are seeing it a bit here as well. Okay, right here we're seeing a line where the pigment has migrated to the edge of the shape. And what that is the more moisture you use, the more time your paint has to move within those puddles. So when you have a puddle of water and paint, the pigment will flow as far as it can and then stop. So the edge of your brush stroke where where the wet paper meets the dry paper, that's where the pigment can't flow to and flow any further. And so you'll get a little bit of excess pigment trapped along the edge of your shape, especially if you're working with a lot of water. If you've got a little less of a puddle, or if you moisten things to allow the color to flow a little further, you're going to see fewer of those little outliney shapes. So I find that when my water is pooled up on my paper so that I've got this little raised kind of surface tension, that usually means my pigment's going to have that time, that extra time to flow into out to those edges. And so if I don't want that to happen, I'm going to need to use my thirsty brush, my sponge, to lift that puddle so that the pigment doesn't move quite so far. The other thing I want you to notice here as we're close to the flower is the bloom. This bloom right here that's been created is creating quite an edge actually that's overlapping my petals. And what is happening here is when I place this brush stroke, my brush was juicier and moister than the paint that was already on the paper over here. And so when that juicy brush stroke met that drying area, the two kind of don't really get along here. They didn't blend perfectly smoothly, and so I've created a line. And so I like to pay attention to stuff like that as I'm painting and watch for it, because if I don't like what's happening, it's easier to fix while the paint is still damp than to wait for it to dry. And again, I'm using kind of a thirsty brush here to lift color and to soften that edge. What you might be tempted to do is add a lot more water and paint, but that's actually going to just move the problem to another part of the painting. That might, I might use a juicy brush to wipe that away, but then the edge of that stroke might create a bloom over here. So we don't want to really do that. You want to just use what I call a neutral brush. So a brush that's not adding new moisture, but isn't thirsty enough to suck up a lot of additional paint. And by using that neutral brush, you can have a lot of control over what's happening without changing things too much by adding an imbalance of moisture onto your paper. My paper's no longer as friendly to fresh pigment and water as it used to be, so I need to start thinking about my exit strategy for letting this layer dry. I'm going to just quickly soften this leaf a little bit. Didn't really love the shape of it. And so just giving that edge, that extra pigment a place to go here with a little water. And I'm going to tilt my board, which is why I've taped my paper to this board. You're probably going to have questions about stretching paper, and that's not something I'm going to address here. Suffice it to say that I don't stretch my paper. I do like to tape it down so I have a little bit of control over the buckling. It does keep it from buckling to excess. However, you don't really need to stretch your paper in this modern day and age. I'm going to touch in a little more green gold here. And there are varying opinions on how to handle your paper. Use whatever works for you. Personally, I don't want to waste time. I just like to get painting, and so I've found that just taping my paper or clipping it to my painting board provides all the support that I feel like I need for my watercolors. If my painting is a little buckled after it's dry, I have some strategies for minimizing that and fixing that. Creating this little leafy edge here gives me a boundary for my flowers. You can see it started to dry here in this petal because I'm not seeing any bleeding happen. Here there's a tiny bit, and it's not a negative thing to wait to paint your background leaves until the flower has completely dried. That's another way of handling it. We are actually going to let this flower dry. We're going to keep it quite simple and loose and open, but we are going to come back and add a few details to just help bring the form to life. This is a loose and impressionistic peony, so it doesn't need to feel botanically flawless, and we want to get the feeling of that rich colors, the full bloom, and then just step away and leave it at that. We're coming back to this dried peony painting right now, and I want to encourage you right now, if you're in the middle of a painting, if you're working on something that's starting to dry and you're just tempted to add a few more details, stop. Give yourself a chance to breathe and give the painting a little space from you. This is a close relationship we're building with our painting, and like all good relationships, you need some time apart in order to appreciate each other a little bit more. And so when I step away, I'm able to come back and view my painting with a new perspective. There's a few things I'm really loving in this scene that I would have missed if I was focused on getting to the next level of adding detail. This beautiful little shape right here, I'm not sure if you can see it the way I can, but it's this lovely soft dusky peach rose color that isn't really appearing anywhere else in the painting. It's a combination of the quinacridone gold that I was using in the center and the permanent rose, and it's just really lovely and soft. And I think if I had kept painting, I probably would have wanted to define this as a nice crisp shape, and it's just so pretty on its own. I'm glad I didn't. And so when I take a step away and don't give in to those temptations to fuss, I'm able to see and enjoy and appreciate my painting, all the things that are working in it, before I push ahead to the next level of detail. Now I am going to continue on, however, and I should mention that I'm really enjoying working with this Kilimanjaro cold press paper, and my American Journey watercolors contain beautiful saturated amounts of color, and they come in nice big tubes, which is really great if you're always feeling like you want to hoard your paint in those tiny little tubes. So I'm just mixing a little bit of the permanent rose with my ultramarine blue, and I'm going to just use some negative painting to define some petals. And don't be intimidated by negative painting. What it really just means is we're painting around the areas we want to keep light, and we do it in small doses, little pieces at a time, so that we don't get overwhelmed. And that's what's worked best for me in many years of painting in watercolor. And the other thing I want to point out as well is that we talk about, often you hear people talk about wet and wet and wet on dry techniques, and that certain techniques happen at the beginning of your painting and only at the beginning. And right now I'm using some wet and wet techniques in adding some additional layers of detail. I can create a shape painting wet on dry. So maybe I'm painting a petal here. Here's a petal shape, and there's actually I'm going to depict a petal in front of it as well, just something like that. So we've got kind of a peachy petal in the front, and then a lovely rose-colored petal in behind. And then I can decide to use a wet on wet technique to add some shadow. So touching in right along the edge of where the two petals overlap, I can create slightly darker value, adding a little bit of that ultramarine blue and permanent rose combination that made that lovely violet. And then I start to get some wet and wet techniques going on. And then from there I can also decide maybe I want some of that color to flow out so that I don't have a strong crisp shape that is independent of all the soft and beautiful things that are happening in my painting. So we work with our wet and wet techniques but in smaller doses in the later stages of the painting. So wet and wet doesn't go away just because we've started to add some detail. It just becomes smaller, a little more focused, a little more controlled. Now this, I want to keep my peony loose, and I don't want to make this lesson long and drawn out. So we're going to keep things simple. But I do want to add some vibrant color. Around here, and I'm sure where you are, peonies are generally known for rich and vibrant color. And so we're going to use some wet on dry techniques to depict some of the richer values in our peony. So I've got my permanent rose, and I have added a tiny bit of ultramarine to it just to make it even a little bit richer. And then from there I'm going to create some petal edges using negative painting. So here I've painted around the side of this petal and along the edge of this petal to create a shadow in behind. Over here I can create another petal painting around this shape here, and then right here it's going to meet up with that wet wash that I had spread out from here, and so I'm going to get a combination of crispness and softness. So my wet on dry technique meets up with my water, so it turns into a wet and wet technique, and looks really pretty. One thing we really can learn from watercolor instructors is creative techniques or creative ways to use the techniques that we already have in our arsenal. I've taken a few workshops where that's exactly what's happened. I felt as an intermediate and then professional watercolor artist that really in a workshop situation there isn't a lot of new techniques that instructors have to offer, even though they have many more years of skill and experience over me. However, what I get to learn is innovative ways of using technique, and sometimes their innovations will actually spur new innovations in my own practice, ways that I can add to my own painting practice in a more creative and expressive way. And we never stop learning. No matter how many years you've been painting in watercolor, there's always more that we want to do and say. There's always more that we want to show, and maybe a fuller expression of our personality in our artwork. I want to give the feeling of layers of petals without feeling tied into painting all of those petals. when I start to feel like maybe I've lost my way, I pull back. I look at my painting from a distance so I can see it with those repetitive words I keep saying, fresh eyes. And then I go back in and add what might be missing, soften what might be too dominant. I'm really liking the layers that are happening here. It's a simplified depiction of what you might see in a peony. There, of course, we know there's different varieties, from the single peonies with fewer layers of petals to the double and triple varieties there. They can be really full and ruffled, or simplified, which is kind of what I'm going for in this representation. Adding a few of those little curls of color towards the center of the flower gives the eye a place to anchor. It's kind of like a bullseye, brings the viewer back into the center here. And I think it looks really pretty. I can decide from here if I want to add more leaves. And I'm going to keep it pretty simple. We're going to wrap this up, but I wanted to show you a background painting technique, because often we start a painting without thinking a lot about the background, and backgrounds actually work best if you've been planning them from the very beginning, thinking about what you're going to do, if not actually painting it a little bit from the get-go. But when you're into a painting, deep into a painting, and then you start to realize that you should have put some thought into your background, it's really not too late. One thing you want to do is just look for ways to make the background look as though it flowed seamlessly from the very beginning. So I might start with the same colors that I used in these leaves over here. The green gold, the phthalo turquoise, or phthalo blue. And then I'd look for ways to flow it out towards the edge of the paper. And as well, you can see the petal here is flowing out onto those that leaf area. So now I'm getting that seamless look that I was talking about. I'm seeing the pink of the peony flowing out into the green of the leaves. And I'm going to actually touch in a little bit of pink right now to give the impression that we did that in the first layer, that we created that softness. And it's with the transparency of watercolor, as long as you're dealing with not too strong of a value contrast, you can get away with that. You can touch in color just like I'm doing right now to create that seamless look where a viewer can't tell what happened in the first layer and what happened further on down the way. But you do have to be a little bit careful with how you let things blend. So I'll add the green, my background color, and then I would go back with the green gold, or you add the green, your background color, and then I might go back into my pink and let some of that flow out as well. Letting that color move and flow across the paper. And now that I have green here and in these two spots, it just feels a little bit more balanced to me. I can let this dry. If I wanted to be really fussy, I might continue to build up shadows, but I don't feel the need for strict realism here. I've got some light areas, some whites that look like reflections and highlights. I've got some darker values that look like shadows, and I've got the dimensional look of layers of petals, skinny little petals unfurling from the center, the petals growing larger and richer in color, the shadows creating that layered look, and then the greens softly framing them on three sides. Which I think is really pretty. It feels fresh and it feels summery, and it incorporates all those beautiful fluid watercolor techniques that I love to show in my work.